We're thrilled to have Greg Hunt with Hunt's Harness with us this evening. Greg's company has been producing very fine harness for everything from miniature horse to four-in-hand coaching to specialty harnesses for specialty breeds for over 40 years. Greg brings knowledge from all over the world, all these people that he's met through his travels and the people that have influenced his life through harness making. I'm very thrilled and very pleased to introduce Greg Hunt. Thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you for the invite. And I guess, as I may have mentioned to you, Tracy, I want to share at least my perspective, and one always has to keep that in mind, information, because I'm a firm believer that any customer, any person needs to have information to judge on their own. And I always encourage people to stay a part of any purchase or any actions that are taken with harness. You know, it's got to fit into your way of thought. If it doesn't, then you need to ask questions until you can somehow get to that point, or maybe decide you need someone else to be your guide on it, we're all in that position. So I believe it's important, because when people understand those things, then they will greater appreciate the things that we're trying to do. And there's a number of other people out there that are putting details or concerned about things that you won't typically get if it's just a harness off the shelf. So I thought it would be good to approach the harness from really kind of a segmented approach. In other words, I'd like to start at the bridle, probably go to the breast collar or neck collar, full collar, and then to the back pad, what we call the back strap or the turn back, and the crupper, and then down to the breeching. And then we can come and talk somewhat about the traces and attachments to the vehicle. So you had a dog issue before. I think I got one now. I was trying to rip my door down, so I'll just completely ignore that for now. So with the bridle, I think you have to look to the issues that you have at hand. Number one, that is you're trying to achieve control over the animal. Now you want comfortable control over the animal, and obviously your only control over the animal is in fact the lines or the reins on coming from your hands on the vehicle. But there are many things you can do which will make that very difficult to achieve if they're spending more time worrying about rub or poking, an ill-fitting bridle. So to segue on that, I know that there are a lot of attempts to save money purchasing at an auction, and there's some wonderful buys, but the down and out bottom line should always be it needs to do exactly what it needs to do. Money and value and put into it maybe, as they used to say, penny wise, pound foolish, because if you create an issue, that's something you have in your control. So if we start with the bridle, you have sort of basics that you're looking at. I use the pole or the top of the head as the primary point to take measurements from. The measurements would start at the pole and of course be logically equal on both sides. You're going to come down from the pole. The first thing of concern in terms of the fit, the comfort of the horse is the ear. So if you come down around straight down, that I should go back and say that anything on a harness in general wants to go from point A to point B. So if you have something at the top of the head, top of the pole there, coming down to the corner of the mouth, it has no reason nor desire to go anything but straight. That's it. So if that puts the back of an ear of some horses or some particular breeds in line with that, now you've created your first problem. And I've seen a lot of people that have that issue, not thinking about that. So that would be the first point, the base of the ear, obviously. When I would make something, I would take a measurement from the pole, the top of the head, down to the base of the ear so that I knew where that was located. Now, that's not a great alteration on most horses, but sometimes the set of it, forwards or backwards from that straight line concept, is where you have an issue. And I'm sure you've seen bridles which have a curve to them at the crown. That's the piece at the very top. And that helps to alleviate coming near the base of the ear. Now, some horses will tolerate a straight crown. And to be perfectly honest, in 50 years of collecting 100-year-old harness, I don't think I've seen one crown that would accommodate a horse at that point. In other words, they're all straight, and they're, like anything else, all is a total word. So I'm sure there are some out there, but the greatest percentage, for whatever reason, would be just a straight shot. But I think today you'll find that you need some relief, and that can be just simply an area cut out of the crown, or a crown given a shape to avoid the ear. So that's first thing to look at, and a major problem. I'll go down to the next one in terms of location, but I'm going to come back to the ear again. You want your blind to be, the eye to be centered in that blind. Now, the size of the blind is really created by two things. The reality of covering the eye on the horse, particular horse or pony or mini or whatever it is, and then also the aesthetics of looking at that animal and its size relative to the head and relative to the body. So that can be as little as a quarter of an inch. And the head, it's a very small area, very small distance. And I always say that the connection of the blinds, in other words, how they buckle to that crown, is probably the most difficult area to give anybody any adjustment or more than maybe one hole up or down. There are ways to alleviate that. In other words, square blinds are considered formal, and many of the vehicles will handle that, will take that, and that's proper. Round blinds are considered less formal, but in truth, if you think about it from a circle, you're actually buckling lower down on the circle. So in other words, you're able to get better eye coverage and center the eye and still have some movement with the buckle up or down on holes on what we call the crown piece again. So I think there's a certain amount of latitude that has to be given to that fact, rather than the idea that there's a tradition that it is only this. Again, we're looking at how it applies to you using the horse safely, efficiently, from your standpoint. So the next thing that I would look at would be from the top coming down, the pole coming down. I would look at the distance to the corner of the mouth. Now, we all know that changes. Some breeds might be 1.5 inches or 2 inches more, without considering, enormous or large draft animals. Some have much shorter heads, Arabians, etc. They might still be the same hands. And that's another concept I'll just say real quickly. People will say, well, I've got a 15-hand horse. Do you have a harness? And I go, well, yeah, he's tall, but that doesn't mean that the girth or the length and all the other details of the harness really are more important than the height. It does come in for function, obviously, fitting a vehicle properly, looking appropriate in terms of proportions, but it's the details of the particular measurements we're talking about here that are more important. And really, you can't buy it on it fits a 15-hand horse. Well, that just isn't what happens. So the other thing you need to know is the types of bits that you're using, because the shank on that bit from the corner of the mouth means the distance that you would have your leather to go through and go back up and buckle. Now we call that any particular piece of leather that buckles itself. In other words, it goes into a buckle and it buckles is called a billet. And that billet coming off of the blinds needs to go down and come back up and to buckle. Now, a little segue here is that unless you mechanically make these things, you really wouldn't think about the fact that to go 1 inch, you actually need 2 inches of leather. In other words, it's got to go down 1 inch and come back up 1 inch. So if you only have half-inch holes or 1 inch holes or 3/4 inch holes on your straps, your billets on the cheek, it really means you're only capable of making, well, 3/4 is 3/8 of an inch. 1 inch is a 1/2 inch difference. Now that may be what you need, but you need to keep that in mind, because if you start adjusting from horse to horse and you need 1 inch, 1.5 inches, well, that means that going back to the horse that doesn't need that to fit the bit or the animal, you're going to have a lot of billet either left over, or you're not going to have enough billet. And generally speaking, people like to see all of the keepers. Those are the pieces of leather that the billet slides into after you've buckled it. They keep it from flopping around, and they actually are keeping a percentage for your availability and truth, not just to be looking pretty in one hole. And that's something you have to consider. You'd like to have things filled. You should always have more than one or be in the last hole. And when I use the word last hole, I mean the short or the longest hole that billet will go to. In other words, it's the first hole on the strap, and that's the longest hole. And I guess in so many ways, you know, if you're in your last hole on the girth, people would understand, wow, you know, I'm run out of room, I've run out of leather. And so that's how I use that term. And even that, when I'm talking to people, you've got to get on the same wavelength, so to speak, or the same term use. Now, that's a rough thing with the cheek and the blinds, and basically coming down from the pole. I'll go back to the brow band. Now, the brow band really is serving a purpose in terms of keeping the forelock down, giving a way to keep your winker stay or your blind holders on the side there in a proper position. It also makes a rounded out look on the horse's head. And that can really be quite detrimental to the back of the ear again. In other words, if the blind is too short, that's the piece going around the forehead all the way around the back side of the crown. If it's too short, you can quickly sense that that's going to pull the back of the crown into, or I should say the front of the crown, but it pulls it shorter. One of the things that typically can happen, again, if you're buying something that's used or you're not paying attention to that detail, and the best way is to unhook the side that you're standing on. You typically be on the left side, unhook that, then stand back, make sure everything is adjusted and feels right from a straight sense of down from the pole to the corner of the mouth, and then bring the brow band around and see where that ends up. Very often you could find that could be a 1/2 inch, 3/4 of an inch short. It's not quite the same concept with a driving bridle to be as tight as it is with a, shall we say, an equestrian bridle. They tend to be much closer fit. So make sure you've got room there. And if you do that, you can always supply someone like myself or anyone who's making something. You can give them a better measurement, because I would go fold to fold, and that's outside leather to outside leather. And a typical and measurement is probably in the 17-inch range, 17 and a half. But you get into some breeds, it might dip down. If you get into Frisians, that's probably 18 to 18 and a half, fold to fold. Fjords, the same way. Part of it is you're accommodating the forelock that's there, and part of it is they just got a wider, broader head. So that's a crucial part. Coming down from that to the noseband, you've got sort of the old two-finger aspect that goes with measurements there. That may be true in a general fit. And I would say that that's going to depend on your use of it, how you like it, how your trainer likes it, or someone else has advised you to use it. But where that is, if you drop that an inch or a half inch, that could probably mean a hole or two holes in the chin or how it buckles. In other words, if you make it for 3 inches below the cheekbone, and then want to go up, you're okay. But you're not going to have many holes, if enough holes to have the proper adjustment. In other words, it's a triangular sort of shape. So that's a crucial measurement. When and if you need to order or buy something, make sure you're at the proper area or the proper height that you would normally use it at. Now that again, to segue off of what we do, I feel it's only appropriate to make something as a two-part noseband, because I think it gives you greater adjustment, and it gives you really earnestly as a customer, you a cheaper part, a less expensive part to replace. You can keep the chin part, which is probably functional on most all or any of the horses, but then you can replace the leather, the single leather itself, with much less effort and cost. Now there's sort of an item here that we call the face drop that comes down from the front. It's a teardrop, some people call it, because it's normally or usually in a teardrop shape. It's not an essential part of the bridle. It's a decorative part. And my thought is I like to see it coming down from the top of the crown or the pole there to the centering of the eye. And it usually has a keeper behind the brow band that it slips through so that it's not flipping and flopping sideways. And at that point, typically the brow band also has a slot large enough for the winker stays. That's the piece that comes down from the top of the crown that will allow you to widen the blinds around the eye or to narrow them. And that's again back to the horse's preference and your preference in terms of control or whatever. But that winker stay will do that. Now, if you want to do that effectively, here again, mechanically, that should have something stiff in it, because leather in and of itself just will not, typically do what you want. So that's pretty well the bridle. So I don't know, I can kind of ask, open it up to questions if someone has specific questions. I'll take that as a no. Okay, we will move forward then. And I think I'm going to skip to the back pad. We'll go to the back pad, surcingle, whatever your choice of words are on that. And the term back pad for us or for myself specifically means that area which is going around the girth, which typically has terrets, which then your reins or lines would run through, and it's just simply a guiding way to run those lines through. Now, at one time, the back pad was the base for the secure base for your checks, your various check systems, over checks, side checks, etc. And typically, you'll still see pads with a C hook, as they were called, or a check hook on them, because I think it's more, this gives a little more touch of brass, a little more elegance and whatever. But historically, that's was its reason. Now, the surcingle typically is a back pad, not a withers pad. The expectation is for that to be back from the withers. Now, everybody likes to visually see that pad run vertically. In other words, at a 90 degrees from the girth coming up to the pad when it's on the animal. But I ran into some horses this last weekend here where they could have that very easily where they wanted to put the back pad because their girth, their bottom, their belly was flat. It was as flat as their back was. Now, most horses tend to have a little more in the girth, in the belly, and things tend to slide forward. In other words, your girth, the actual piece that you're buckling to your back pad, tends to slide forward. So you typically have somewhat of an angle to it, and that's not improper. I think it's just a reality of what is happening with the back pad relative to the belly. Now, part of that can be helped out in terms of keeping it back if it wants to move forward by the back strap or the turn back. That's what's attached to the back pad on the back side. That runs to the tail, the back of the tail, the dock, the rear of the tail, where your crupper goes. I think historically, that tail became the anchor point for checks, because in and of itself, the pad could be pulled forward by the kind of intensity that the checks were requiring of it to hold it. So, and typically you're going to see harnesses with the back strap or the back, the turn back, as many people call it, therefore to hold the pad somewhat from going forward further than you might want it. And also that too serves a purpose. It's a platform, put your hip strap or your breeching hanger on. In other words, you run that through loops which are provided or keepers on the top of that pad, which should be at a location that is just slightly behind the point of the hip on the back end of the horse. So when you are using the hip strap, you'll come down from that point, which is very close to a vertical descent to the front edge of your breeching, which is somewhat coordinated with the stifle on the horse's leg. So the actual height of the breeching is kind of difficult to say in a verbal way or indicate to you that there's a preciseness on how to measure that. You want it reasonably level. That's also going to be determined on where your girth, I should say your shaft carrier or shaft ties go to from the breeching. Some of the older vehicles have them very close or very far. The pullback of the breeching should be as straight as it can. In other words, you want to adjust your hip so that the hip strap so that it holds the breeching so that it's pulling straight. Now, if it doesn't pull straight, for instance, the top front part of the breeching is higher than the straight line over to your shafts, there's going to be pressure coming down on the back of the horse, which may not be bad in terms of backing and being able to have the horse well grounded, but it's also, you need to be aware of the fact that it's creating a great deal of pressure on that hip strap. So you'd like to have it fairly straight. As far as placement horizontally, that's a tough one, as I say, to verbally tell you, but you want it up far enough that it's not actually, I always relate it to a person, if you were in a tug of war and you put the rope behind your back, you'd probably would have a certain point at which you'd realize that it would go up over your rump and you wouldn't be holding anything. If you allow it to go too far down, you realize that it's ultimately going to take your feet out from underneath you. There's that certain curvature at a certain point that you want the breeching to be. And the measurement of that is related to that fit, that point. The measurement of the hip strap is from that placement. So you're coming down from the top of the the rump down to the top of the breeching as a measurement. And then you're going around from roughly the stifle all the way around to the other side of the stifle. And you should be able to get room in there. In other words, as you well know, your horse has got a gait to it which may be elongated with the legs in the back. You've got to give it freedom of movement there, but then you want it also to touch or come into the animal reasonably soon in terms of actually braking or helping to brake or stop the vehicle from coming forward. So that's a tough one there. I found that when I have people measure their own harness or fill in the harness charts that I have, if I get something that's out of equal proportion, I always will question it. In other words, I'm always reminded of the Da Vinci photograph with the man with his arms stretched out and the legs and everything, and then how the proportions are there. And it's interesting because typically the height down from the rump is equal to the same distance from the stifle to the rear, the half that distance, or it's the same distance as all the way around the breeching as it is up and over the top of the breeching. Now, the hip. Again, some breeds are wider at the hip. Then it's not the case. In other words, they're slimmer down at the bottom where the body of it is. But it's an indicator to me to have something checked again or looked at from that perspective of measurements. Now, I've said a number of parts and pieces, so I should open it up again for questions if there's anything relative to the pad, the back strap, crupper, and breeching.
I have a question, Greg.
Okay.
With respect to the back pad, I also call it the saddle. But the back pad itself, proper clearance over the back vertebrae. How much space do we need and how far down on that padding do we need to go coming over the top of the ribs, particularly when it applies to a two-wheel single horse vehicle, which is what I drive. And I have a very round mare with no wither, and I feel like I'm bunching her at the spine. What kind of clearance? I mean, I know how to fit like an English saddle. Is it that kind of a clearance underneath on the back pad that we're looking for?
Well, I think if you look at all types of saddles, Western or English or whatever, you don't want a direct pressure on the top of the spine itself. Now, that's been pretty accepted, pretty standard throughout any kind of horse equipment. Now, as far as how much, you have to realize that a lot of this stuff is interpreted by most people when a horse is standing still. So you've got to keep in mind the kind of pressures that are created or the movement that's created, which will decrease more than likely increase spaces. So I've gone to giving quite a bit of height. Now, if I said 2 fingers or 3 fingers, 2 fingers is probably, reasonable. 3 fingers is certainly better. But now you brought up another point that's a definite detail. It depends on the back of the horse. When I said before, it's not a withers pad. If you find that the pad wants to, for whatever reason, move forward onto the horse and it becomes closer to the withers, well, you're talking about an uphill slope here. So that's different in terms of what might be necessary to give clearance enough to the withers, which i.e. is the same thing as talking about the spine going up. So as far as pressure on the pad, you want to equalize the pressure as much as you can throughout, shall we say, if you looked at a circle, and of course the horse's back is not a true circle, it's probably more oblong or whatever at the top, but that concept, you're trying to disperse that weight over the greatest part of that half circle. That's only logical and reasonable. And your predominant, effectiveness is going to be at the very, very top. Now, I've been advised by, well, one person in particular, PJ and Tara. They were talking about the reality that was neglected perhaps in the old days, is the reality that nerves and blood lines run through to the side of your spine. So it's their feeling that an expansion of that area is appropriate because, yes, you're not directly on the spine. You and I wouldn't like that either. But on the other part, we do know that you can be really, kind of messed up in terms of flow of blood or restricting nerve endings on the side of the spine. So I generally make those widths 3 inches or more. Now, again, if I were to rely on all of the tons of equipment I've seen, and unfortunately all the old pads I still have up in the barn, I don't think they cared nor knew perhaps about that. They had an excuse for amount of gap or space, either in width or in height. So I think there's more concern for the horse these days than perhaps there was 100 years ago, even though obviously that was a valuable animal and you wanted to take care of it. But I think there was neglect in some of these areas, and the back pad predominantly is one of the areas that could be really pointed out as poorly designed. And the back pad, if it's made, for instance, I don't think there's a horse today, except possibly Hackney ponies, that I could use the frame from a gig pad, which is what people typically call a pad, which has what I call a sliding bearing strap on it, or a two-wheeled vehicle. In other words, the billets, that the leather that comes out of the pad at the top there, goes down to the shaft carriers, that will float. And it's appropriate. In other words, a two-wheel vehicle doesn't necessarily have lateral stability like a four-wheel vehicle does. And if you have fixed shafts to that four-wheel vehicle, they have every reason to return back to normal. But there's still stress there, but not like there is with a two-wheel vehicle. Side of a hill, rut in the road, these things all get transferred back to the back of the horse quite quickly if you don't have movement, freedom of movement. So I would say, back to the specifics of the pad, you have a two-wheeled pad, which most people would call a gig pad. They were predominantly used for gigs, but I think they could be used for anything, and in one context should be used for any two-wheel vehicle. But the lighter the vehicle, the smaller the animal, and the more perfect the conditions, i.e. the show ring, I think you can get away with fixed billets on a number of two-wheel vehicles. But I still think you'd be ahead with going with the flexible, because even if it wants to move an inch, just think of yourself being belted in and being asked to give that inch, then another inch, and then, back and forth. So it's distracting. And at the very worst, it can be not harmful, but it can start to cause rubbing problems or annoyances that you're going to pay the price for. I did have a discussion many, many years ago with Tom Ryder, and I was saying that I thought even down to Meadowbrook should have it. And he said, well, really not that necessary, but it won't hurt, let's put it that way, to have a sliding bearing strap, i.e. a gig pad, as most would call it. So I think your answer, you want a fairly good width of a gap. The gap should be at least 2.5, 3 inches. Of course, that's my fingers. So if I said, 2 inches, maybe is the fairer way to put it, But if you're way forward, you might need more if you're coming close, or you have a withered horse that goes further back, where it becomes an issue of contact. You always have to think of the weight and the working of the vehicle onto the back pad, even with the shaft carriers there, sometimes they almost become part of the braking, the way people have it set up. So that's a lot of pressure. So, and back to my point, the original pads, most all pads, old pads that I can pull out of my barn and I've seen are like the letter A. You know, they're going to put so much pressure on, say, let's just say 3 inches out from the center of the animal, that I can't help but be something a pony's going to be aware of, or a horse. When there's any pressure put down, it's going to be like somebody putting their thumb into your shoulder versus their hand on your shoulder. Again, the angle of the attack and the amount of padding, et cetera, the width of it is helpful on some vehicles, but in truth, ultimately, you should be dealing with a balanced vehicle. Now we go back to maybe the precise way to do it, and then the realistic way with which people have to either put up with vehicles that are the way they are and tolerate something because it's appropriate to a certain class or a certain format. And that's where it gets, you know, you've got to be a part of that. You've got to know your horse and know how it's going to handle those things. So as I say, the pads can be a real source of problem if you don't pay attention to that detail.
And what about elasticizing the girth versus a non-elasticized girth and billet holder?
You know, ironically, I just got done with 3 of them for Kohler because they use them on their horses when they're training. And I can't see that it certainly hurts anything to do it. I don't know that the amount or the tightness, because of the shaping of the saddles that we make and everything, that they need to be terribly tight. I mean, obviously, like a riding saddle, you don't want it so it can swing around on you. But I don't know, to be perfectly honest. I think you'd have to talk to more trainers and see whether they're seeing a total overall result difference from using it, or individually. Some horses are just real funny about getting girthed up, and they in specifics need it. Whereas, you know, I mean, I kind of crank on my riding horse, and I don't see any issue with that. But then you can get other ones that are just going to be cinch shy. So I don't know if that's answering your question. I can't say that I personally have seen enough to have a preference to go that way.
Thank you.
So, any others on those areas? Okay. Yeah, on the full collar, what we call a full collar and a breast collar, or I almost think a breast strap is more definitive, because you can visually see when you say breast strap, you know what I mean. Whereas I say a breast collar, that's a little bit iffy. And a full collar is the one that essentially is going all the way around. An English full collar, as they're called. Ideally, the full collar has better contact over more area than a breast collar would have. But let's face it, when it comes to a collar, you need a very good fit. A so-so fit is probably only going to create a problem for you. Now, each and every breed, similar to each and every foot that we have as humans, you know, it's kind of a miracle. You can just go buy a size 8D and it fits, but we all know that some ways you kind of have to wear them in, so to speak, and that's typical and accepted. Some of the collars have that kind of flexibility, or they're going to have a certain amount of flexibility to wear in to fit a horse. If you're using a collar on multiple horses, well, then you can see that's kind of becoming an issue, that the fit may not be able to change appropriately. One of the issues with a full collar is the fitting of the hames. The hames are, I would say you should consider the hames to be appropriate to one collar. Now, I know that's an expense. I know that that's a great deal of the cost of a full collar is the hames and the tugs that go along with it. That's the attachment that you would buckle to your traces. But in truth, you can get away with more on a single harness than you can get away with on a pair harness when it comes to the fit of those hames. You have one piece, if you ever used collars or you ever talked to people about collars, there's one strap of leather probably in the entire harness, which is the most important one to keep track of, and that's the hame strap. If the hame strap up on top of the collar breaks, it's like losing your drawers. Everything just goes down. There's no reason for it to stay on. So the hame strap is extremely important, but the same is true of fit. If you have any kind of hame that's fitted to, say, let's just say a 21-inch collar, and you think that you could use it on a 23 because that's only 2 inches and you just get a longer hame strap, that's really not the case, because you have to start at the most important place, and that is the draft part of the collar, the draft part of the hame. That's the little tab, the little piece on the lower 1/3 of the hames that your traces get set to. And that goes from point A to point B also. In other words, anything that inhibits a straight line is going to have stress on it. And that also determines where the major amount of pulling or pushing, as I guess is the word of the day now, the vehicle, that should be dispersed primarily at that point on the shoulder. And again, it's very difficult to, without a graph, and this might be a good place to have the picture, but you want it at that point of the shoulder, a little up from the I don't know the proper term, not the clavicle, but up a little bit higher than where your breast strap would fit. Now that then is also dispersed along the entire collar. So the hame being there distributes the pressure from the vehicle, and it goes up the entire distance on the collar as much as at the one point. So if your collar doesn't fit your horse, i.e., it's too long and it has a great deal of movement up and down, or it's too wide and slops around on the side of the shoulder, that's going to create a problem for you. And then same thing with moving a pair of hames. You can do it, but you should be very, very clear that you're starting at the anchor point of the hames and putting that where you need it, not where it ends up. And then you can either add more chain to the bottom, which is typical, or more strap, depending upon the particular hames you're using on a single, or you can add, and you can add a longer hame strap. But if you can't make it functional where the draft point is where it should be, then you really should just not do it, because undoubtedly, if you put it there and the hames are too small, too short, they're going to practically fall off the collar. So the tendency again is to fit the hame to the collar, not really properly using the pressure point of the anchor draft. So again, on collars, you have various shapes. You have a straighter one, and that will fit, in other words, you could almost lie it flat on the table on the rim side of it. And then you have curved or laid back collars, which of course have that nice, elegant flow back on them, but not every breed can handle that, because you may get a lot of top pressure on the animal and little contact with the collar on the upper, let's just say quarter of the collar on the inside. You'd like that collar to hit as much of the surface as you can. So it's not a matter of golly gee, this has to have a straight collar, or it has to have a what a lot of people just simply call a K collar. You know, fit's got to be first. And the other issue, going back to the brow and the brow band area on an animal, is that a lot of animals, and this is one of the, I would say, the hard parts of a full collar, is that there's a number of animals out there and a number of breeds which are more inclined to it, but the brow, the distance and the width between the outside edge of the eye sockets there is actually narrower than what you would like to have your collar. So people then go, oh, gee, I need a wider collar to get over. And in that case, it ends up being sloppy on the animal. In other words, vice versa. You need a narrow collar on the neck, and you can't get it over their head. And I always jokingly say you've got a giraffe all of a sudden, because they just aren't going to want you putting that collar on. And now collars, I should say this because I've seen them put on both ways. If they're really on the narrow brow size, you can put a collar on vertically the way it would end up being used. But most collars are put up on upside down, turned at the neck for the very reason I'm talking about. That brow is quite wide and generally is almost snuff the size of what you need at the neck. But generally speaking, on the breeds, you're going to need a bigger collar, not a smaller collar. But when you need that smaller collar, don't make up for it that way. And at one point, it was not considered proper to have what we call open top collars. Many, many years ago, it was frowned upon, and it never made any sense to me, because essentially they were telling you that you really couldn't use a collar, number one, I guess. Number two, if you did, it was more proper to have it go over the head and be fixed than it was to have it do its job on the horse. So we've accommodated some collars, not a lot, but with an open top, which when it pins together, and the hames strap and strap we put on the collar, it allows you to open it up and gives you maybe another good inch or more that you can do a proper slide over the head, come it down, and then tighten it up again. So that's one issue with a collar that you can be confronted with. The other thing with a collar is, of course, depending upon the time of the year and how fit they are, a good fit is hard to get with one collar. But the breast collar is, as I think can be said, is one size fits all to a degree. And again, you have horses that hate a breast collar, but they'll go with a full collar, or vice versa. So again, back to the individual animal. But on a breast collar, it's the same point, that you're trying to balance the pressure that's being applied by the traces in the vehicle coming down on the shoulder. The thing you do want to be careful of is that on a lot of breast collars, if they don't give relief on the body of the breast collar, again, you'd like to have a wide breast collar, so that's dispersing the pressure. You can start to have issues with cutting off the throat down at the bottom, and you may have some refusal based on that. And in terms of fit, there's a greater variance of the length of a breast collar. I like to see it probably 3 or so inches in front of where your back pad or your saddle ends up lying, so that there's no conflict with the buckles or anything in turns or any particular change in the straightforward motion. But practically speaking, I think it just looks more appropriate in terms of looks. Now going back from that, are there any questions on collars or breast collars? Okay.
Yeah, I guess. Oh,
okay.
I was going to ask a question on the false martingale. So that attaches from a breast collar to the girth. In terms of fitting that, I know it's supposed to be loose, but I've seen some that once the horse is actually moving, seem like they might be somewhat restrictive.
Yeah, as I understand it, I feel that a full collar needs the breastplate, which we will call the false martingale, in order to hold that bottom of the collar down. It serves a function as a purpose. In other words, when you're backing or holding the vehicle back and the pull straps tighten up, they tend to pull that collar out. Well, that's a natural action, but I think there's a certain amount of needing to keep that in balance or pulled down. As far as the breast collar is concerned, I think, unless there's someone can tell me a different reason for it, it's really just an additional piece. In other words, if you find that the specifics of your horse in the action of your horse drives the breast collar up into his throat, then you may in fact need it. Most cases you don't see that. And so it's sort of one more piece that I call slices and dices an animal. Unless you need it, you really shouldn't be required to have it there. And I don't believe that in a show ring you are required to have it on a breast collar. But I don't think you'd ever see one refusing to use a breastplate or a false martingale on a full collar. It's far more functional.
Very interesting, thanks.
So
Thank you for saying that, because it has been consistent with what I have heard, but it's not what I see.
okay,
And I
Well-
understand that you do use it with pair, but not a single.
I think that that's a generality of truth there, and there we are. As I said, back to the specifics of a breast collar and its action, you may want to keep it more down in place, but then
Yeah.
that's back to the particular animal. But I've been told, and what I read and what I see is that it is not a required item on a breast collar.
Thank you.
So if there's no further questions on that particular area, then I would say a little bit about the actual attachment of your horse, and that being the traces. I mean, that's the most direct and only real contact that you have with the vehicle, yourself, and the horse. In other words, that becomes potentially a safety issue, which I can talk about with the pairs. But the singles, I've had a lot of people with an issue with the tugs, what we call the shaft carriers or shaft tugs, which hold your shafts up, ending up running generally in front of the back pad, rather than lining up nicely in an appearance sake and probably a practical sake in line with the center of the pad. One of the things there that I soon discovered was I think people generally had their traces longer in relationship to where they wanted the shaft carriers to be. So that ultimately the horse moved forward until he got contact, which was typically 2 or 3 inches forward of where it needed to lie. So then when they used the shafts at another shorter hole, they found that corrected itself in that way. But let's face it, you're trying to balance off the look, the reason for the point of the shaft being where it is on the shoulder, and you're trying to balance out the reality of either having the animal too close to your single tree on the back, and or having the animal out far enough. See, there's a balance there. So I think you can make up for some of that with the trace length. Now, if you go to the pair setup, you have an issue with essentially what looks appropriate or looks the neatest is on the hame tugs, coming off of the hames on a full collar or a breast collar. There's what they call a lead up. That's a little short piece of leather with a buckle on it that would attach the hame tug, which comes off the hames, and attach the buckle where the traces buckle into on a breast collar that goes up to your back pad or your saddle. And when a horse is in draft, you want to see that in a true vertical inline parallel or whatever with the pad. So if you've noticed, and maybe now we'll take the time if you haven't seen it or made mental cognizance of it, that those can be behind the back pad, which is usually considered the tug or the breast collar is too long, or in action, in under, duress, they end up being in front of, and that you would consider to be too short in either the long tug situation, which is for the pair, the collar, or the breast collar. So that's one thing to look at, and that's more aesthetics. Other than it getting radically longer or shorter, it would perhaps start to involve pulling and tugging on your back pad itself. One is holding it up. That's really what you're trying to do. If it gets too long or too short and goes forward or backwards, then it may actually be putting pressure on the back pad. So, and then to the rear of the vehicle, there are different accepted distances you want your animal to be from the vehicle. With combined driving, they've got one concept, with pleasure driving another. But if you start there, where you want that to be 16, 18 inches from the bar there, and then going forward to the pole, as I was told, I think it was even Tom Ryder, you want a 45-degree angle to the pole head. Now, if you have a custom built or an adjustable vehicle, you can accommodate those things. But if you have an antique vehicle, you may find yourself jockeying that distance to get the hames, or I should say the pole straps, appropriately to fit, and then to have the distance you need at the rear end of the horse. So that can be a problem. Sometimes it's too bad you couldn't just take the old proverbial saw and take 6 inches off the pole and make it right. But heaven forbid, on an antique, you'd never do that. So you can accommodate it with more modern vehicles. But what I wanted to say is that's the point that really your horse becomes one with the carriage, traces, and the pole strap, and a pair setting. And so I always highly advise quick release fittings, of which there is a historically appropriate quick release fitting for the traces and for the pole straps. And they will operate or work under duress. In other words, if the horse is down, or as I see, they could be hanging upside down from a tree with the trace quick release, you could give a strap a release and they'd fall right out. And the same way with the pole strap. When you have what they call a gram loop or a trace square, where you actually thread it through, put it around the roller bolt, if there's stress on it, you're going to have a hard time getting that animal out. You're going to have to unbuckle. You have to get some release somewhere, and that's when the knives start coming out. And really, it's safer for the horse and probably cheaper for the owner to be able to get in and out quickly. So that's what I would say on the attachment of a pair there and the traces. Short of trace carriers, you have attachments to the breeching to keep the traces so that the horse can't step over in a pair. On the forehand, you have trace carriers which thread through the back strap on the leaders for the same reason. If they go out of draft long enough, they can get awfully quickly one leg over a trace. It's still not impossible with a trace carrier, but highly unlikely. So I think that kind of runs through everything. Might there be other questions? I guess I leave it to you then, Tracy.
Let me unmute here. I'm having Barkerama in my backyard and I'm trying to figure out what's going on. They're not normally out there for 45 minutes barking their heads off. I want to thank you very much, Greg, for imparting this knowledge that you've spent many years accumulating. And I'm sure that we're all going to think of questions at a later time. And is there a way that you would like us to contact you if we would like to talk with you further about either purchasing a harness, fitting a harness that we may already have, straps that we may need to make differences because maybe a harness we got from you might need an extra piece or two? Is there a way that you wish for us to contact you?
Well, I think that if you go to my website, you can find my email address there, which is a little bit long to hand out, but I'm also very open to phone calls and on my cell phone, which I think is also on my website.
Yeah, huntsharness.com.
Correct.
Is for everybody who has not had the opportunity to look at that website. It's a beautiful website and there's lots of information there. It'll show you some of the beautiful things that Greg and his company have made for the horse industry over the past many years of servicing this tradition of carriage driving. And I can't thank you enough for all the information. And if you've got tips and tricks, we've got a newsletter every month and we'd be happy to publish something with your recommendation. As an example, at the beginning of this call, for those of you that weren't on it, at the very beginning, we were discussing a product from Lucas Oil on how to polish your brasses, and it's a tumbled oiling polish, gunmetal and tumbling polish. So those are kind of tips and tricks for the trade. If you've got anything that you want to impart to us for our newsletters, we certainly would love to have them. And I'm sure Debbie can find a creative way to weave them into the fabric of our getting things ready for spring and getting our harnesses ready to go. And having you as a resource, Greg, I can't thank you enough.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to present some of these things. And as I believe I said at the beginning of this, I think an educated consumer is absolutely the most important thing that there is, because they are better prepared to see what I am offering or any harness maker is offering. And there's that choice in there because, there are choices in material, there's choices in hardware, there are so many choices and the quality, etc. So if you have a little better feeling of what it is you should be looking for or understanding in terms of the fit and the, I guess, the care that's gone into the making of it, that's important, really. So again, I thank you.
And the traditional, historical vehicle versus, combined training vehicles and singles versus fours, et cetera. There's so many different things that are so many variables, and you've dialed it into a very good conversation for us tonight, Greg, and thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you too. And as I say, please call. I'm open to that. I'll try to be as responsive as I can with emails. But thanks again.
Thank you.